Greetings once again, both to the Pilgrim Church family and also to any visitors who have tuned in for today's daily online spiritual encouragement or dose. This is Danny once again on behalf of the elders at the Pilgrim Church of Christ with our study for Tuesday, July 27th, 2021. Well, last week we concluded our multi-week study of the 7 statements of Jesus from the cross. So today we'll mark a return to my digital archives to once again gather the materials for today's consideration. I'll be using an article I originally wrote for the Shepherd's Voice, which is found on the front page of the Pilgrim Church of Christ monthly bulletin. This one comes from August of 2017, so that's almost 4 years ago now, and it's entitled Swift, Slow, and Slow. I'll begin today's study by reading from the New Testament book of James, which, by the way, is one of my favorite books. I invite you to turn to the first chapter of James and follow along with me as I read our reference text. I'll be reading James chapter 1, verse 19, and this comes from the New King James Version. So then, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. The first thing we should note regarding this passage is that in the original Greek, the word man simply refers in a generic sense to a human being. With that in mind, we find this instruction from James to be applicable to both male and female individuals, and everyone at that. Our second note of interest is how James addresses his words to, quote, my beloved brethren, unquote. This term for brother is used by James 15 times in the book's 5 chapters, and at least once in each chapter. James's writing of these inspired words stem from an intimate affection that he undoubtedly felt for his readers, thus giving all the more reason for his instructions to be closely heeded by those claiming to be lovers of and believers in God and his Son. Unfortunately, many of us today may find that we're actually more prone to be slow to hear, swift to speak, and swift to wrath. That is, just the opposite of James's urging. If we should find ourselves among those in this situation, how then do we combat such a contrasting mode of action and instead adhere more closely to what we know to be a much better way? As with most personal traits, it can best be accomplished by progressing in a step-by-step manner, bolstered with the intent that our ultimate desired result would correspond with God's will. Fortunately for us in this situation, James presents, through the remainder of his first chapter, just such a step-by-step process for us to adopt. Let's examine then his 4-step pattern. Step 1. This is verse 21, again from the New King James Version. Therefore, lay aside all filthiness and overflow of wickedness, and receive with meekness the implanted word, which is able to save our souls. Our first step is to receive, or as the original Greek indicates, accept God's word, doing so meekly in deference to its authority. James reminds us that the word is able to save our souls. What better reason could we seek for choosing to do so? It should also be noted that receiving God's word means we have to first be willing to lay aside all filthiness and wickedness. Step 2, found in verse 22, still the New King James Version. But be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. James warns that receiving God's word is not limited just to being hearers of what he has to say. We must realize that we are being called to be more than hearers only. We must study his word regularly so we might understand that meeting his challenge involves action on our part as well. To do otherwise, we're told, results only in deceiving ourselves. Step 3. Verse 23, again, New King James Version. But he who looks into the perfect law of liberty and continues in it, and is not a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work, this one will be blessed in what he does. Our next step in responding to God's Word builds upon the previous realization of the necessity of doing what His Word says. James tells us that when we choose to make it our nature to do God's will in all aspects of our life, when we, quote, continue in it, unquote, God will in return bless us as well as the actions that we take in His name. And the fourth step is found in verses 26 and 27, once again, the New King James Version. If anyone among you thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his own heart, this one's religion is useless. Pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their trouble, and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. Even after we have received God's Word, after we have recognized our need to be more than mere hearers of it, and after we have decided to continue to be found living within it, James presents yet one more final step in our progression, that of putting his word into action within our individual lives. Such a decision and determination can be manifested by that which we pursue, we develop, and we practice as a natural trait of our personal character. James lists them as bridle the tongue, visit orphans and widows in their trouble, and keep oneself unspotted from the world. Putting God's word into action in our daily lives can make an eternal difference between, quote, thinking we are religious, unquote, and genuinely demonstrating, quote, pure and undefiled religion, unquote. I thank you for making and for taking the time to view this study today, and I pray that you'll continue to be able to tune in and view each week's latest video offering. Remember, if you're unable to view any of these videos on the Tuesday when they're first posted, you'll still have the additional option of accessing them from our online archives. You can always find these archived videos in a couple of sites. The first is the Pilgrim Church of Christ page in Facebook, or the second, which is the Pilgrim Church Media page within YouTube. So until next week, when we'll look at another passage or another event or another list, I urge you all to study God's Word during some portion of every day, as well as to go to Him daily in prayer. And within that prayer time, you can give thanks to God for all your blessings. You can lay before Him your needs and your requests personally, and you can remember and beseech God's care for those who are in need of His intervention into their lives for various reasons. Lastly, I assure you that you continue to be in my prayers daily. Now, let me close today's study with an encouraging benediction passage from God's Word. I'll be reading from the New King James Version from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 58. Therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, stand firm. Let nothing move you. Always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. Hope you enjoyed today's little study, and I pray that every one of you is safe and is healthy and is doing well. Wish you all the best for the coming week, and look forward to presenting another study next week. Until then, take care, and remember, I love each of you. Goodbye.